Welcome. I am so glad that you are joining us for our, week 4 book chat over chapter 5. I am joined today with Kevin Dykema. He is the current president of NCTM, former, is it eighth grade math teacher?
Correct. Eighth grade.
Wonderful. Yes. And author of Productive Math Struggle. So I am so excited to have him join us. Make sure you say hello in the comments. Let us know where you are watching from. We are going to be diving into all things chapter 5. It has been a great book study up until this point. And I'm really excited to dig into, okay, how do we actually support productive struggle during the lesson? And so that is what we're going to be talking about today. But before we jump into that, Kevin, do you just want to, share a little bit more about yourself? Maybe what led you to writing a book on productive struggle?
Absolutely. Thanks, Brittany. And welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to be with you here and just share some more about productive math struggle. So I've taught eighth grade math for over 25 years. And I knew early on with my students, when I just said, here's step 1, here's step 2, here's step 3, it didn't meet their needs. And they were like, why in the world are we learning this? So I knew I needed to adjust what I was doing, have them make sense of the math, which is really what productive math struggle is all about. We want them to make sense of the math. We want them to engage and to do that deep, heavy thinking with that. And I served on the NCTM board from 2016 to 2019. I overlapped with John Sangiovanni, one of the other authors. And John said, hey, Kevin, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I said, nope, I've never thought about writing a book. And he said, you need to. I need a middle school voice on this book that I have floating around in my brain. And I said, sure, John, I'll gladly write a book with you. And that's how it started. And it was a great collaboration. And he found Susie, so we have 3 different voices. And it was a great time just thinking about how do we help educators, how do we help all of you really support students' thinking in mathematics?
Yeah, that's an awesome story. I didn't know the backstory to that. When John Sangiovanni asked you to write a book, you say yes.
Absolutely.
That is awesome. And, it's funny that you start with, talking about your experience in teaching math in a way where you were telling students the steps and then them repeating them and how that wasn't really effective. Because when we were looking at this chapter with how to support productive struggle in the classroom, I really think it's important for us to kind of go back to some of the things we've talked about in previous weeks around what is the ultimate goal of learning and or of learning math. And on page 119, so just a few pages into this chapter, at the very top, it says, the goal is to advance students' understanding of the math. Now, so that's not necessarily the ultimate goal of teaching math, but when we're talking about supporting productive struggle in the classroom, we want students understanding the math. And it sounds like when you were just telling them all of the steps, you weren't really getting that understanding of the math from your students.
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't. It was very procedural. And I know that many of my students saw math as a series of disconnected procedures, that in their minds, math was just memorize this procedure, spit out an answer. And they didn't see the relevance for it. And certainly students today don't see the relevance for it when they walk around with a calculator at all times. I mean, you may know it as a cell phone, but let's be honest. It's a calculator and so much more. And yet so much of what we've done in the past just doesn't work for our students because they're saying, why do I need to memorize this formula when I can just say, hey, Siri, what's the formula for the area of a parallelogram, for example? And it really needs to be, we need to support that student understanding. We want to get our students to understand what they're doing. And I would argue when they understand, then also they're that much more willing to continue to learn mathematics.
Mhm.
And when we learn more mathematics, we're increasing opportunities. We need to continually focus on, I need to continually focus on, what am I doing to increase opportunities for every single one of my students? And getting them to understand what's going on brings that extra relevance, brings that extra meaning to our students' lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's interesting. I was reading obviously this chapter says what we're talking about. So I was reading it, and on page 18, there was this section here. And I think it was talking about the difference of, when we are supporting students in that productive struggle, jumping in and telling them the answer versus like rescuing thinking, which we're going to talk about in a bit. But there was a section that I highlighted, and it was I think it went on to say that the teacher jumped in and was giving them the process, giving them the steps. And it said the process handed to them by their teacher is disconnected from their understanding of the math concepts. A teacher may feel good about the result in the short term, but if students over time do not retain the concept, it can be immensely defeating to both student and teacher. And that part stuck out to me so much because it actually brought me back to, I think, like page 2, where at the very beginning, I think you and Susie and John were talking about your experience as a math student. And you said that your, in quotes, understanding was fleeting and fragile. And it said it faded quickly. This loss of understanding undermined our confidence. And I think that, this is all going to come together. But I think when we're talking about, wanting students to understand and be learners and how that provides opportunities, I think that if we are not maybe teaching in this way, it can really hurt their confidence and their belief in themselves as learners. And it can kind of communicate that they don't have the ability to continue learning, or they don't have the ability to pursue these other things if we as teachers are constantly jumping in and giving them very prescriptive, this is how you do this. So I don't know if all of that made sense. It made sense in my brain. As soon as you said that, I was like, oh, it reminds me of this part.
Very much so, it makes sense. And I think everybody reaches that point where there's some math concept that they have to wrestle with more than others. And if we've never provided opportunities for students to engage in that thinking, when you hit that point, all of a sudden you start thinking, is math for me? Am I capable of learning math? And I want those opportunities to happen in those nurturing environments in the K-12 system, so that students are recognizing, yeah, it's okay that you're wrestling with it and trying to make sense of it. And math is very understandable. There isn't a reason why we need to just teach math as this rote set of procedures. Nobody likes to just memorize a rote set of procedures. We need to get our students actively engaged and get their brains turned on. And I shouldn't be the only one mentally fatigued at the end of a math lesson. My students should have some of that mental fatigue as well, because then I know that they're learning.
Yeah. I actually sent out a quote that you had put out maybe in like an NCTM position statement or something like that, about if we teach math as a rule or as a series of tricks, we're communicating that math is not understandable. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
that was so good.
Well, thanks. Yeah, that was one of my president's messages that talked about that, and it's so true. But I think that's historically how we've taught math. I think traditionally we've taught math as a series of tricks. Just memorize this procedure, and I mean, it's true. You need to think about that, the fostering the positive math identity. No fostering of math identity is happening when we're saying math is so difficult. I need to teach you all these little tricks. I need to teach you a butterfly method, or a keep, flip, change, or keep, change, flip, or flip, change, keep, whatever you end up calling it. That we need to make sure that students recognize it's not just a series of random rules that somebody did to torture us. Math makes sense. There's a reason that the properties of exponents are the way that they are. There's a reason that the formula for the area of a trapezoid is the way that it is. It's not just this random set of stuff. And too often our students see math as all this randomness, and we need to break that down. And honestly, for many of us, for me, I don't see all those connections. I didn't learn math that way. I learned math very procedurally, and I have all those aha moments, and it makes math so much more enjoyable for me. And when I allow my students that freedom to think, and I support their thinking, I learn so much more about math. And I'll be honest, the way that my students view a problem is often drastically different than the way that I view the problem. But their way often makes so much more sense. And I'm like, oh, this makes sense now. Now I see why it is. And it makes it so much more enjoyable for me as an adult educator.
Yeah, I was actually talking to a group of teachers yesterday, and one of the things we talked about is how our own light bulb moments as teachers fuels our teaching. And we should be having those light bulb moments because honestly, it makes us better teachers. It makes us more excited, curious, passionate teachers. So I love that. But something that you said in that is you started touching on students' identity and just like their math stories. And there was an article that, I don't know, maybe you were one of the authors. I cannot find this article to save my life. It was an NCTM article. I think it was in the Teaching Children's Mathematics series. But we did a book chat or an article chat over this article years ago, back in 2018. and it was on productive struggle. And one of the things that they said, so I hate that I cannot cite this author. So if anybody remembers back from 2018, what article it was, send it to me so I can, quote the author correctly. But in the article, the author talked about how when we are supporting productive struggle, we should be communicating competence and confidence. So essentially like or was it the other way around, competence and competence, essentially saying like, I know you can do it, and then instilling confidence in them. And it's like I love that, because I think that how we go about supporting productive struggle during a lesson can really build students' identity as learners of math.
Very much so. When we portray the message that math is understandable, they start to develop that math identity that, oh, I really can do this math. And I find that in my own teaching. I play dumb very, very well. And thank goodness my principal knows that it's just playing dumb. And he often say, the way you're like, oh, I had never thought of that before. He said, I know you have, because you taught it so long and you had both of my kids, and I know that you know how to do the math. But you play dumb so well with the students that they see that they're discovering something brand new. And you're making them feel like they are competent and able to do it. And I love that competence and confidence. I'm going to have to go back and look at some old articles to see if I can find who said that. 'Cause what a great two C's to be able to incorporate into other things. It's so important. We need to build our students' confidence. But I think it's building that confidence through that competence, helping them recognize you are able to learn math.
Mm-hmm.
You are able to develop a good, solid understanding, and it goes hand in hand with each other. That's awesome.
Yeah, we'll have to find the article, but I did take notes because I actually rewatched our book chat over it, and of course I didn't put the title in the book chat, which is a miss by me. But everybody watching we all had the article out, but they gave us some really good questions. We're going to get into just some different tips and moves for how to kind of like nurture, foster their support that productive struggle during a lesson. But some of the questions they provided I thought were really great, and I'd forgotten about them, so I wanted to share them. But they said, so in the questions that you ask, they said project competence and confidence. So they would say, first or what they say, state something about their work, and then ask a question that instills confidence. So you have an idea. What is it? You've done some work here. Tell me about it. I can see you're thinking hard about something. What is it? I can see you're using your hands to do something. What are you doing? And I love that. I love that it's pointing out that you are competent. You are doing something great. Now tell me about it. So I just thought that added in, it was just such a great bonus tip to all of the things that we're going to unpack from chapter 5, because y'all just did such a wonderful job. This truly is actionable. I felt like this chapter, I just was highlighting constantly with the different moves.
That's nice to hear. I mean, that was our goal in writing the whole book, was to make it very actionable and put a little bit of theory. But as classroom teachers, we don't have time to try to figure out how to implement something. So we were very purposeful in trying to provide a wide range of strategies, and recognizing that what works for one student isn't going to work for another student. I think that's one of the parts that keeps me in education, is helping figure out, how am I going to help this kid learn this concept with that. And I can't just keep doing the slower and louder approach and keep doing the same thing over and over and over. I've got to try something different. So we were purposeful in trying to provide a wide range of different ideas to help meet students' needs.
Yeah. And that actually connects back to, I think, what we talked about maybe in chapter 1 or maybe chapter 2, where it talked about really understanding your students and understanding where they are at and their identity, and the behaviors that they typically portray when they are struggling, because how you then support them is going to be dependent on who they are as a learner. So I love that. And, there was a section in here that talked about, what was it? Rescuing answers versus rescuing thinking. I would love to hear just a little bit more from you. One of the things that I think you pointed out was that rescuing thinking leads to maybe more long-term understanding, whereas rescuing answers is kind of like that short-term win. Can you just kind of expand a little bit more on that, or maybe share some of your experience with the difference between those two things?
Absolutely. And I'm not sure that I had that really clear in my head until we wrote this book. And when we thought about, how do we rescue? I was a great answer rescuer. And if I'm not being self-aware in my classroom, I can be a great answer rescuer. But I progress past the I don't tell a kid what to do anymore. Now I put it in the form of a question. And if I'm not being consciously aware, I'll say, all right, what are you gonna do next here? Are you gonna add or subtract? And the kids that subtract, like, oh, way to go. Now what are you gonna do? Are you gonna multiply or divide? And you mean, and I feel better about myself, and I shouldn't feel better about myself that I didn't just tell them. But then you walk away and you hear the kids say, I have no idea what we just did. Or 3 minutes, you're back and you're helping that same exact student with the same problem, just with different numbers. And that's when I know I really focus on rescuing that answer rather than rescuing their thinking. And rescuing the answer is often, it makes us feel better. It makes me
Mhm.
feel better sometimes. It makes me think, oh, look, I was able to help this kid in 15 seconds. Now I can go help a bunch of other kids, but it's not helping them. It's not leading
Yeah.
to that belief that they're able to learn math. It's not resulting in learning that sticks. And I think so often, I hear as I work with different districts and different teachers, to say, doesn't this notion of productive struggle take longer? And I say, depending on how you define take longer. Think of
Mhm.
many topics and how many times we practice them and we reteach them, and I call reteaching really loosely there. It's really retelling them numerous times throughout a single school year or through multiple school years. What about if we actually get the students to understand what's going on and help them make those
Right.
connections? Might that lead to better understanding for students? And we need to do more of that. And that's really that rescuing the thinking. But that rescuing the thinking is hard for me. That's not what I can do just in the heat of the moment. I can't come up with those good questions. And that's why, when we think back to that chapter 4, when we're planning for that productive struggle, you really need to do the problem ahead of time and think about, all right, if a kid's going down this path, what might I ask to do for that? And that's really key for me. I don't come up with those great thinking questions on the spur of the moment. It's got to be ahead of time. Or sometimes at the end of the day, I jot myself some notes and say, all right, hey, here was a great question to ask. Don't ever ask this question again. Because as much as I like to think I have a great memory, when I'm not teaching that concept again for another 365 days, it's gone by that point in
Yeah.
time. And I keep reminding myself over and over and over, rescue their thinking, rescue their thinking, rescue their thinking, spend longer with that group in order to be able to do that. And yeah, it's so important to be able to make sure that we're catching their thinking rather than just helping them get that correct answer. And getting the correct answer is important, but it's really about developing that competence and the confidence that you talked about a little bit ago.
Yeah. I think it's really encouraging to hear you say that you are not strong at coming up with those questions on the spot.
Oh,
Because I think a lot
not
of
at all.
teachers can read this and it feels like, oh my goodness, like why didn't I think of this? Or why am I not able to do this 100% of the time in the moment? And it's just a reminder that even the author who wrote the book is still growing in this. And also, I think the fact that um oh, I lost what I was about to say. Oh, that it's a skill. It is a skill. Like the more that you do this, the more that you work to rescue thinking, the better you get at it. So it's not going to be, okay,
Yes.
I've read this book. Next school year, August 1st, I'm going to be perfect at rescuing thinking. It's something that comes with a lot of time and reflection. And if you are a teacher who is departmentalized and teaches multiple class periods, I'm sure you've experienced your last class is probably your best class because you're like, I've done this 4 times. I'm growing each and every time. I think it's the same way throughout the school year and over the course of a teaching career.
Very much so. And I'll let you and the rest of the people in on a little secret. There are some days that I am lousy at supporting the productive struggle. And there are some days that I'm good at doing it. And we all have those good days and those not as good days. But the key has to be when you have one of those moments, you're like, oh, I totally blew that, to not give up. We need to keep pushing
Mhm.
forward. I love the way that you said, it's a skill that with time, you're going to get better at it and you'll get better. I get better at the different questioning. And there are some days that there's a lot of room for improvement. And there are other days that I'm like, all right, I did a decent job of meeting the students' needs. And what works with one group of students isn't going to work with that next group of students, whether it's next year, whether it's in that next class, if you're departmentalized. Kids are kids. They all bring their different, unique experiences. And that's why it's so important that we just continue to work hard at meeting students' needs. and helping them recognize that math is understandable and really supporting them through that struggle.
Yeah. So I had a thought. This is interesting. So if we're connecting, the maybe like the cognitive load or just like how heavy it feels to I'm brand new with productive struggle. I'm having to now think about each and every student and their abilities and what is their behavior communicating to me and all of that. It made me think about students who are in the working towards fluency with their multiplication facts. So like
Mhm.
initially, it's a lot. It's challenging. They're working on, like, let's say multi-digit multiplication, yet they're still struggling with the heaviness of not being fluent in their facts. And as they develop that fluency, it becomes something that is so much more natural for them and it makes the other work easier. I wonder if this is similar to this this newness of supporting productive struggle. It can feel heavy and like I've got to remember all of these things now, but the more that you do it, the more it just becomes part of who you are. And recalling these questions or having an eye of curiosity for students' behaviors, like what is that behavior communicating about their struggle? It becomes something that eventually becomes somewhat natural. It doesn't mean that you're perfect at it, but I think it becomes less overwhelming. Would you say that that's relatively
Oh, very much
accurate
so.
in your
Yeah.
experience?
I mean, I think that's the way we learn anything. When I think about every time our district switches to a new grading software package or an internet-based one, that learning curve feels monumental for those first few weeks. Like, oh my goodness, I don't remember how to do any of this stuff. But then you keep doing it, and all of a sudden you start to get a little bit of that muscle memory, and it starts to make sense. Learning math, learning to support students in productive struggles that same way. It's difficult at first, but the more you do it, the better you start to feel at it. And you start to be able to get some sort of go-to questions that you can ask. And yeah,
Hmm.
it's yeah, the more you do it, the better it's gonna get. And it's always tough, for me at least, to learn a new instructional strategy. It is so much easier for me just to stand in front of my classroom and do things the way that I learned as a student. But I know that's not meeting the needs of my current students, and I've got to be willing to try to
Right.
do things differently if I'm truly interested in meeting the needs of every single one of my kids. And engaging them and
Yeah.
supporting them in productive struggle is so vital.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked so much about the importance of it, of the importance of productive struggle and the role in the classroom. So now let's dive into just how we support productive struggle in the classroom.
Yes.
So starting on chapter 16, actually not chapter 16, page 16, 116, actually page 119, there's all these struggle moves. And so I'd love for us to just kind
Yep.
of like go through a few and unpack them. And one thing that I was thinking as I was reading these is I was like, these are all so good. This does not mean that you have to implement every single one of these every single week. These are moves that are in your toolbox that you can pull as you feel comfortable, as you see a need for them. It is not this not every tool in the toolbox has to be used at all times. So I hope
Correct.
everybody,
And every time I go back and reread a section of the book that we wrote, I'm like, oh, I'd forgotten about that one. And that's okay. I mean, we naturally gravitate to a couple that feel most comfortable to us, or that we think, oh, I can see myself using this. And the goal that we need to have is to find those additional ones that are going to really help support student thinking with that. So one of my
yeah.
favorite ones is that second struggle move, the catching and the releasing. That I
Hmm.
know early on when I started to have them do more thinking, I wait till I have the class summaries until the end of the class. I sort of have this launch the task, let them explore, and then we'll summarize. And quite honestly, that's too late for oftentimes. I love this notion of catch and release that, I launch them, I get them started on something. But let's be realistic. If I go and work with group A and they're wrestling with, they're at a spot where they're all stuck, for whatever the word stuck
Hmm.
means, on something, I help them. I go to group B, they're stuck on the same thing. I go to group C, they're stuck on the same thing. I can just about guarantee the rest of the groups are stuck there too. Why not instead, for the sake of time efficiency and for classroom management and just for student positive beliefs, call a quick timeout and say, hey, you know what? I think we're all really wrestling here at this point in time. Let's try to make sense of this. Then put them back and say, get back to work now. I'm not going to finish all the thinking for you, but we need to do that. So now mine looks much more like launch, explore, summarize, explore, summarize, explore, summarize, explore, summarize,
Hmm.
and then get that final summarize at the end. So that's one of my favorite struggle moves to really focus in on is, not waiting until the end because kids don't remember what they did 7 minutes ago when they pushed through that and got an answer. They're focused on that. We need to get them to that point.
Yeah, I think catch and release. So I was catching and releasing before I knew that there was a term for catching and releasing, but it was
Yes.
one of, and maybe it came from laziness because after the second group asked the same question, I was like, all right, let's go. We're bringing it in. But it is
Yes.
such a powerful move. And I actually got some really good tips from this section too, as far as, when I was catching and releasing, a lot of times it was very heavily discussion based between but just as a whole group. But I think one of the things that I highlighted here that y'all had put in the book was consider recording students' thoughts during the catch on the whiteboard where students can see it later. And that's not something that I ever did. So I love that just even that small tweak to how I was catching and releasing with students. And I also love as a former athlete, I love your timeout analogy. That's very much what it feels like.
Yeah, it is very much so. I mean, and it's important to be able to do that. And I also
Yeah.
really
And I
appreciated, the first struggle move, the prepping the task. That I need
mhm.
to remind my students ahead of time what happens when you start to feel yourself get frustrated. What are some moves that you can make? Because we can all picture that student that when they hit that point, they're starting to get frustrated. It feels like it goes from 0 to 100 just instantly. And if I'm not prepping that ahead of time, if I'm not reminding them about why is taking a deep breath so important, why is looking at that referral chart that we may have on the wall or someplace so important, sometimes that's too late. That I need to just continually remind myself, all right, before we dive in and really grapple with it, let's do a couple of those quick little reminders with it. And even when in a middle school you see their eyes roll, they're like, all right, we know because we do talk about this all the time. They still need those reminders of what am I going to do when I hit that sort of boiling point.
Yeah. And so, it's interesting. So I love your angle on that prepping the task, like prepping them so that they know what to do when they struggle. The thing that I wrote down from that move was actually the validation that comes from struggle as part of math. Because I think about like my experience really doing anything hard, but we'll say like at the gym. I heard somebody say one time, um, this is going to be hard. This is what hard feels like. And anytime I'm doing something that's hard, I tell myself that because it removes all of the like judgment or shame or negative self-talk that I have for myself about why this is hard. And so for me, I connected it to this section because when we tell a student like struggle is a normal part of what you're about to do, it's a normal part of math. I think it can maybe minimize, if not eliminate, some of the negative self-talk around, oh my goodness, I'm dumb because this is hard, or I'm not good at math because I'm slow. And so I really liked this move because it put at the forefront like what we value in the classroom, and struggle is valuable in this classroom.
Very much so. And I know that, and later on in the chapter, we talk about the value of mistakes. And I had to remind myself it's okay for me to make a mistake as well. Because when I'm telling my students, hey, mistakes are valued, it's a signal that we're learning, and all those things that so many of us say. But then when I make a mistake, I'm like, oh, I'm so embarrassed, you guys. I can't believe I did that. What message does that really send to the students? They
Right.
really sends a message that he doesn't really mean that mistakes are okay, that being good at
Yeah.
math means you're never making a mistake. And I need to continually remind myself if I truly value mistakes and see those as good opportunities for learning, I need to be okay when I make a mistake. And we all make a mistake. And the worst things that some teachers do is that some teachers will say, oh, I purposely did that because I wanted to make sure you were paying attention. No, you didn't. Just own up to that. You're a human being and it's okay to do that. And when I think about
Yeah.
mistakes, so often, my students will make a mistake and they get frustrated. Like, no, 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 time out. You had so much thinking. Let's figure out what problem did you really just solve? And for so many of
Hmm.
them, when they're able to figure out, oh, here was the problem you gave us. here was the problem that I did. Then all of a sudden they're like, oh, now I know what I should have done to get the correct answer to the problem that we're working on now. And so often students think it's sort of an all or nothing. And I don't want to make it this
Yeah.
all or nothing. Mistakes are very valuable, and mistakes they show so much thinking that's going on. And it's helping our students recognize what is that thinking that you're doing with that.
Yeah. So we're jumping around a little bit, but I think this is actually maybe one of the recommendations under like the navigating struggle section. But the my favorite no, that was a favorite of mine in the classroom. And I think the reason I love that so much, and I don't know exactly how, I believe it came from the teaching channel, that routine. I don't know
Yep.
exactly how it was recommended to implement it, but I would have students talk about the things that in the work sample that the student did right before we would talk about, and maybe that's how they tell you to do it. I'm not sure. But in that, looking at that, the reason I love this routine is because it validates that everybody knows something about math. There's this quote from John Tapper. I actually pulled it. He says, even if students' thinking is convoluted, complicated, or just wrong, there's almost always an underlying logic to it. And I think when we can, whether it's through the my favorite no, or even just having the discussions that you have with students, validate the fact that they did something right. Like they were on a path. They just maybe like derailed just a little bit in this moment. But I think again, instilling that confidence and that competence and saying, okay, you did it right. You even said, like, what problem did you solve? Saying that they did something great. They did solve a problem. It just may not have been this problem. And let's figure it out.
Absolutely. And it's so important. And it builds into, it goes back to the building that positive student identity, that they start to see themselves as capable of learning math when we continue to portray that message that, yes, you are capable of learning math. And there's a reason that you're learning the math. It's not just to memorize this rote set of procedures. That math is very understandable. Math is relevant. Math is useful. And we need to continue to push those messages with our students and to really back up our words with the actions that support what we're telling our students in terms of all of that.
Yeah, John and I, after our book chat for week one, we talked a little bit about how it's so easy to say we value productive struggle, or that speed is not what we value in the math classroom, and then our actions actually portray something different. I know I had a situation when I was working with a small group of students a couple weeks ago where that was the exact thing. We were rushing, and I could see that I was pushing into a classroom, and I could see that class was almost over, and I'm just like, okay, show me your answer, show me your answer. And I was like, oh my goodness, my actions just completely communicated the opposite of what I continually preach that I say I value. So it's a good reminder to constantly get those actions and words in alignment.
Well, there's that whole time factor in school. And, when you're in an elementary setting, you've got to get our kids ready to go to specials at this point in time. And when you're in a secondary setting, that bell's about to ring. And there are times, just for the pure sake of what we think of efficiency, we just all of a sudden sort of steal some of that at the end and try to wrap it all up because we feel this need that we've got to have it done by this end of this arbitrary time. And not all students learn at the same rate. Some students are taking a little bit longer. And that makes juggling this notion of how do we support productive struggle, it makes it so much more difficult. In some respects, it'd be wonderful if all students learned at the same pace. But to my way of thinking, that brings the joy of teaching away then. I love working with those kids. I love seeing that student who's really worked hard at it, all of a sudden just see that connection happen. Like, oh, now it makes sense. And that's so powerful. And it makes teaching so much more enjoyable.
Yeah. And to your point about, every student understanding, like not everybody gets it at the same time. There was a section on page 132. I literally wrote in my notes, read this quote. So I loved it. It was actually talking about the move for referrals, which goodness, there were so many great things under this move. But this section though, it was talking about, I think it was right under the multiplication charts, and it was talking about giving students access or referring them to these tools. And it said, there are other unproductive, deeply held beliefs about using these tools that need to be countered. Some believe students just need to be able to calculate. yes, students should be computationally fluent, but it takes time to achieve this. And each and every student does not develop in the same ways or at the same rate. And we can reason that and we can reason that accessing these tools supports development of fluency, and that the more students use these tools, the less likely they will be to need them. And I love that because it just calls it right out. It calls out the fact that we often think that giving these tools to them is a crutch and that they should be able to do it. They're not going to be able to use these tools later. But I love what you said, that every student takes a different amount of time. It's okay to give these tools to them, and they won't need them forever.
Absolutely. And if we're being realistic, some of the stuff that we teach, our students are never going to do again outside of the K-12 setting. I mean, as adults, when is the last time you multiplied a 3-digit number by a 4-digit number? Probably never. Because you probably just grab a calculator or you grab your cell phone and do that, especially if it involves decimals, because nobody wants to have to work with decimals. But we spend
Right.
so much time with our students, and we think that all our students have to do that because we view math as getting that correct answer. I think it's much more important that a student can look at a problem and say, oh, I need to multiply here to get an answer. And if they have to use a referral chart, if they have to use the hundreds grid, the 10 by 10 multiplication grid for the rest of their life, or if they have to grab their cell phone and quick do it, who really cares? Because ultimately they're able to make sense of that mathematical problem. And it's got to be the making sense. I heard somebody not that long ago say, I'd rather have a kid know when to add than know how to add single digit numbers, because we can address the how to add single digit numbers, but
Yeah.
it's the getting them of the when it's adding the adding instead of subtracting that can be a challenge for so many students.
Yeah. And so I can almost hear the teachers watching this. I can hear the thoughts in their head right now screaming, okay, I get this, but students are tested on how to add. Students are
I know.
tested on, can they multiply a 3-digit number by a 2-digit number? So in practice, how do we, I guess, like balance these two things of, we know that as soon as a student turns, 13 or 10 or whenever the age is that kids get cell phones, they will have a calculator in their pocket. And my performance, students' performance in math is still evaluated based on this test score.
Absolutely. And that is definitely a challenge in education. And I love the way she talked about it as a balance. That we have to find that balance and make sure that we're giving our students opportunities for both. And thank goodness some assessments are finally starting to change and starting to focus more on understanding and providing some of those additional tools that students can use, rather than just having to be with all of those basic facts, for lack of a better word. And it is definitely a challenge. And that's the hard part about education, that so often what we know is best for kids isn't what's assessed. And for many of our
Yeah.
livelihoods, we need to make sure that our kids are jumping through the appropriate hoops in order to keep our jobs and to keep paying our own bills and supporting our families and such. And it is definitely a difficult thing in education right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to also say, so like, yes, this is true that it is a challenge in balancing it. And I think sometimes I think sometimes teachers will say, or I've heard in, the circles that I'm in, um, I've got to teach to the test, they need to show growth. This is the expectation at my school, whatever. Teaching for understanding, having productive struggle, all of that takes too much time. I can't do that because I need to, get certain performance on end of grade tests. And I will say that even still, I still think, and it's been my experience, that we can still um, teach for understanding. We can still foster that productive struggle, or create learning opportunities for that productive struggle. And it does translate to the test. I know it's not all about the test, but it does transfer to the test as well. So I don't think we have to, I think we can hear our brain saying, oh, but the test, and also recognize that teaching in this way, the test is just one form of
Yes.
them showing what they know about math. And I do believe students who have a in-depth understanding, who are proficient in math, when we're looking at like what math proficiency truly is, not just like what we say math proficiency is on a test, students who are truly proficient in math can perform well on the test if we take out things like test anxiety and did they
Yes.
have a bad day, fight with their mom beforehand. Like those are all very real things as well. So I think we can't let the test keep us from instilling productive
Correct.
struggle in the classroom.
Very much so. And I would argue, when a student engages in this productive struggle and starts to make sense, it comes back to that confidence and that competence. They feel more confident and they feel like
Mhm.
they recognize, hey, I am able to do this. So when they hit that standardized test question, they may have to wrestle with it a little bit and they may do it a slightly different way than somebody else. But because they know that math is understandable, I do have the skill set to be able to do it, I am all set there. And I think we've had this unhealthy obsession with the most efficient way for so many things and pushing our kids to do it a single way. But when I look at my GPS, if I'm going to plug in something, it's giving me three different options, and they're all going to lead to that same spot. Some may take a little bit longer to get there. But when I think about learning, if we wanted to go just a single way, well, that way doesn't make sense to me. Something that may take somebody else a little bit longer, but yet it makes sense to that student, that's going to be really much more efficient for
Mhm.
them to do
Yeah.
that. And we have got to continue to engage our students in making sense of the math and engaging them in this notion of productive struggle so that they recognize math is not just a bunch of procedures to memorize, because that's turning off our students. And even if our assessment is very much blah 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 blah, boring boring boring, it's just, yeah, as you said, it's one single snapshot of it, and we've got to
Yeah.
move past that. And oftentimes, when I work with some teachers who would say, "Oh, I would change, but it's the assessment." I'm like, "All right, well, tell me how you're doing on the assessment." "Oh, my kids are horrible on the assessment." I'm like, "All right, so what you're currently doing isn't working to help them with the assessment. Why are you not willing to try to change something? And it can't do any worse on the assessment. So let's look at doing things differently." And lo and behold, your kids are going to do better on the assessment because they're recognizing, hey, I can do math. They don't start out with looking at question one and saying, I'm not a math person. Peace out. This is going to be a horrible next 30 minutes of my life.
Yeah, that is funny. That logic, that's perfect. I'm like, you know what? I think my husband and I, he is like ELA social studies and I'm math and science, or at least that's what it was when we taught together. And I firmly believe that being in math all of the time makes me a very good arguer because I have the logic to be able to look at things and say like, okay, well if A equals this, like exactly what you just did. Well, if your test scores aren't great, why not change your teaching? Like the logic there. That's what
Yes.
we just need to tell students. Like part of the reason you're learning math is so that you can win any argument you have. The critical thinking is great.
And then you may be onto something there, because then kids would definitely want to learn more math. And I think that speaks to math has to be more than just finding that correct answer. It has to be about justifying and explaining their reasoning and explaining your thinking. And kids so often think that means you have to write out these long paragraphs. Forget that. That may be the way you justify your thinking when you're dealing with language arts and social studies and other things. In math, explaining your thinking just means you need to have something down on paper so that somebody else can look and follow what you were doing in order to get your solution strategy in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, we've totally gone off on a tangent, but a fantastic tangent. But coming back to the second part of this chapter, there were so many great tips for navigating the struggle, and just maybe some not like do's and don'ts, but to some extent, some things to be mindful of in supporting
Very much
students
so.
as they are struggling. I love this first one about don't restate more than they say when you are revoicing. I think that is something that I definitely struggled with because I tend to be a little long-winded. I also tend to fill in a lot of blanks as I'm listening, and so I think that this is such a good reminder. And I think that like the implications that come when we fill in our own thinking into what students are saying can be really negative for the learning process. So this was just a really good reminder for me. I appreciated it.
And I need a reminder every single day for me because I am lousy at that one. I want to revoice. And when I revoice, I say, oh, in my head, I had this whole little talk. I got to make sure I say it a little bit louder than what the student says and get rid of all those ums. And it has nothing to do with that. My students have learned don't listen to each other. because Mr. Dykema is just going to restate it, and he'll probably say it a little bit clearer and add a little bit. So I need to continually work on don't be adding additional things and really allow those students there. And I have this horrible habit, if I'm not being aware of it, of jumping in and finishing a student's sentence. And I love
Mhm.
when a student says, "No, that's not what I was going to say. This is the way I was going to do it." I'm like, "All right, keep my mouth shut, Kevin. Actually listen to the kids there." And it's so powerful, and it's one of those things that I think so many of us really wrestle with and really struggle with, that because we have this notion sometimes, because it's the way that we grew up for so many of us, that the teacher is the purveyor of knowledge and the teacher just has to
Mhm.
tell the kids what to do. And I think that that first teacher tip, that don't restate more than what they are, that's really getting to that point of, I shouldn't be the purveyor of the knowledge. I need to be bringing it out of
Yeah.
the students and helping them make sense of the mathematics with it. So that's I need that teacher tip every single day in the classroom.
Yeah. And I think what you said there about, I typically have said it as like the teacher is the beholder of all knowledge, but I heard an analogy once. I think it was, we think about students as like these empty vessels and we are just like pouring all the knowledge into them and not recognizing that they come to us with um, understanding and experiences. And it was just so interesting. I remember the standard. It was my first year teaching fifth grade, and it was 5 and F3. So it's fractions as division. So, 2 divided by 3 is 2/3. And I remember, my team teacher taught it in like a day, like a half a day. He walked in, he said, 2 divided by 3 is 2/3. So 3 divided by 4 is what? 3/4. And we just, and I was like, why is this even a standard? And, as I started to explore it, and in my master's program, we read some of the CGI books and all of that. And I realized we talked about equal sharing problems, right? And, you have 2 cookies and you share them between 3 people. Like students have the ability to figure this out. And it's just so funny. So I've got a 6-year-old now, and I've done this work with third through fifth graders, but I'm just curious. I was like, could my 6-year-old figure out how to share 2 cookies between me, him, and his brother? And sure enough, he can do it. He has experience there. And so my role in talking to him is not to tell him, hey, 2 divided by 3 is 2/3, because honestly, he doesn't even know what 2/3 is right now, like as a fraction. But it's really to help, like, um, I don't know, to like help like shape his understanding of it. Like he has got experience there. And throughout time, it'll be really to, I guess, like shape that or help him figure out how to use that and apply it to other things. So I just thought that was just such a neat reminder that students don't always need us to add to their thinking when we're revoicing. They've got understanding. We've just got to listen and be curious and be looking for it.
Yes, and we need to build on their students' brilliance. And I love the
Hmm.
way that you noted that. And I often, as I'm working with teachers, we talk about fractions, and we think, oh, our kids don't know anything about fractions. Yes, they do. Even a 5-year-old does, because you get that last
Yeah.
cookie and you tell the two kids, cut it in half. I often like to say, I was the loving older brother. I cut that cookie as close to half as I could. My younger brother, who had been, I don't know, 4 or 5 at the time, his would be more like 1/3, 2/3. He would get the 2/3. I would be robbed of that 1/3. I must have pitched a fit one day, and all of a sudden it switched, and my dad would then say, all right, whoever cuts it in half, the other one gets to
Yep.
choose. Well, my younger brother, who used to make it 2/3, 1/3, instantly went to half and half, or as close as you could eyeball it. So we know that students are bringing this prior knowledge, but so often we don't build on that prior knowledge, and we don't recognize they do have so much beginning stages of so many different concepts, and we just need to find that and build on that. And it's what's make math teaching so challenging and so enjoyable and so much fun, when you find out,
Yeah.
oh, this is the way you were thinking. Let's really build from there.
Yep, absolutely. And it goes back to that quote from John Tapper around the fact that
Yes.
there's underlying logic to everything students are doing. We've just got to find it so we know what to build upon.
Yes.
So I love that. The other tip from here that really stood out to me was it said consider when to help and when to hold back. And of course, I highlighted like every bold question that was there. but I literally put 3 exclamation points right by this section right here.
Yep.
And it was, does the struggle contribute to better understanding? And I think this is a really important thing to talk about, is the fact that not all struggle is equal. And there is some struggle where we should be jumping in to help, where we should be jumping in and providing supports. And there's other struggle, I think, where we use some of these moves. So I think there was actually an example in the book. Maybe it was that students were struggling with the context of tennis balls. Was that in the book or did I make it up? I think it was, there was a problem. There was a situation where there were tennis balls. There was like 3 tennis balls in one of a can, and there were 17 of them. And students couldn't get past the idea of a ball and a can because they'd never played tennis before. That is not an example. They're not struggling with the math there. They're struggling with the context because they don't have that prior experience. And so it's really not contributing to their understanding to leave them in this place of struggle over the idea of a ball and a can.
Absolutely. And I think we need to find those spots. And, sometimes I hear people say, oh, a teacher should never tell a student anything. Baloney. There is a time and a place for the teacher just to say, this is the way that it is. And, there are just some of those standard conventions, and there are some of those contextual things that, yeah, do I want my students spending 15 minutes trying to make sense of the context of the problem? Or can I jump in and say, all right, hey, let me rephrase, let me help you a little bit here, just tell you, here's what the context is saying. Now that you know what the context is doing, now you can go from there. I find that sometimes there's a problem like to do with the Pythagorean theorem in middle school, talking about how far is it from home to second base, and I make the assumption that everybody knows a little bit about baseball or softball and know how a baseball softball diamond is set up, but not all my students do. And if I want them to spend 10 minutes trying to make sense of that, that's 10 minutes wasted, or maybe 9 minutes wasted. I can just jump in and say, hey, let me provide a little bit more of that background information so that you can make sense of the problem. And now you can actually get to what was the math behind some of that.
Yeah. And we think about this too when we think about students struggling with reading. How can we
Yes.
support them in understanding the concept from just like being able to read it versus them sitting there, because they're struggling readers, they're not able to comprehend what's even happening in the problem. I think about this also with our multilingual learners. I interviewed Georgina Rivera on the podcast, and she had some great tips around how she uses like Google Translate and AI to translate anything in any language. And even just thinking about that, I was supporting in a classroom where I think they had like 5 or 6 different languages in the classroom. And I was sitting with the teacher afterwards. I was like, I don't even know how you do this. I mean, that is just challenging when you don't speak those languages. And so even thinking about that, it's like when we're talking about productive struggle, we're not talking about a student who is sitting in the classroom and struggling because they don't understand the language. It's how can we provide support with that so that they can productively struggle with the math. And so that was one I was like, we have to talk about that because not all struggle is equal. Not all struggle is productive around the math.
Correct. Absolutely. And sometimes it's the vocabulary. I could have 2 kids arguing about, is the top number of the fractions at the numerator or the denominator. Having them debate it for 3 minutes is unproductive at all. That's the time where you just step in and say, here's the standard convention. The top number of that fraction is called the numerator. And let's move on at that point in time. And we know we have students that's going to just wrestle with that vocabulary. Let's be the educators. Let's just provide that vocabulary for them so they can continue to make sense of that problem and get to the really important parts of the concept.
Yeah. We want the struggle to be over like the learning goal, right? Like what are we wanting them to learn? That's where the productive struggle should happen, not over some of these other things that we're talking about.
Correct. Absolutely.
Let's see. I love also what you pointed out about early finishers. I think that's a really important thing just to be mindful of what we do with early finishers, what that communicates to the class if they're an early finisher, and then they're directed to go around and help everyone else. So I think that was a really really interesting thing to point out, and I think something to be mindful of.
Very much so. And there's then the next one is about adjusting the time, and it's time is a consideration without a doubt, and not all students learn that same rate. So you just have to be prepared. What do you do with that student who takes a little bit longer? And what do you do with that student who happens to finish a little bit sooner? And it doesn't mean that the student who finishes sooner is any more intelligent than the student who takes a little bit longer. And oftentimes, those students who take a little bit longer are the ones that are making better sense of the math because they're really grappling
Hmm.
with what are those connections, and they're getting that deeper understanding than sometimes our fast finishers were. And it's just telling stories to our students of that speed is not the indicator of that. And I love to share, in my college calculus class, that there was one student that finished after 45 minutes, everybody else finished after an hour and a half. And guess what? That student who finished first was taking calculus again the next year. It didn't mean that they did well with that. That speed is not necessarily an indicator that you know what you're doing. And we have to be willing to continue just to remind our students that speed is not the end all be all of mathematics.
Yeah. And I think this actually ties really nicely into kind of the last point that I had about celebrating struggle. And I think
Yes.
when we say, speed is not what we value in the math classroom, we've got to be so mindful of what are the things that we're celebrating? What are the things that we are highlighting, praising? And I love just what you put in here around um, celebrating the strategies that they used. Like, I liked how you changed the numbers to make the problem easier to work with. You weren't sure what to do, but then it became more clear when you used less complicated numbers. So, really just being mindful of what are we celebrating? What are we lifting up as good mathematics in the classroom?
Yeah, and it is important to celebrate. And I know the next action is going to be on reflect, and that'll be your next conversation. But I think it's so important that we spend that time celebrating with our students and doing that little bit of reflecting. And for the people here who haven't gone to that next part yet and haven't worked ahead, that reflecting is so vital because that's going to build that student's confidence. And I love that confidence and the competence. And I'm going to have to keep using that. But when we spend the time pointing back and saying, hey, remember 2 days ago, you thought this was the world's most difficult concept and you would never know how to do it. Now, because you didn't give up, because you changed the numbers, because you did whatever, now look, now you have that
Yeah.
confidence. Now you're saying, I can do this. And we as educators, we need to make sure that we're spending that time celebrating that success with our students at a grade and an age appropriate way.
Yeah. There's this book. It's not a math book. It's not an education book. I honestly don't even know what category it falls into, but it's called The Gap and the Gain. And it's talking about how so often we are looking at like the gap from like where we are and where we want to be, that we don't take enough time to reflect where we are and where we used to be. And so I love, like, I guess the gap would be, where we're
Yeah,
looking ahead, and the gain is like the progress that you've made. And so I love that you pointed that out, thinking about, yeah, like when you first came to this classroom, I remember you telling me like, I hate fractions. They are the worst. I cannot do it. I'm not a math person. And now look at where you're at. And you're so right that even just that push to reflect on their progress and reflect on the gain does instill so much confidence. So I love that.
very much so.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was so wonderful to get to chat with you. You'll have to, everybody, comment. Let me know in the comments what your biggest takeaway was from our conversation. I would also love to hear what is one action item, one thought, one just something that you are going to prioritize implementing from this chapter. I know I've said it every week, but if we read all of this and we have these lofty goals to implement every word in the book, nothing will get implemented. So choose one thing from this chapter. Let me know in the comments or go back and on one of the posts from the week and comment that here. But thank you so much, Kevin. I know that people will want to connect with you. What is the best place? We'll like link all of the places for you, but where's the best place that they can connect with you if they want to after, this hour together?
Yeah. You can go to X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it. And I think on that one I think it's at K Dykema, not very creative. I'm on Instagram. In Instagram, I'm on it, but I'm not as active as I need to be with that. And I think there it might be at Dykema Math. We can do old school style and do email, dykemamath@gmail.com. I'm sure if you
You're
just Google my
consistent.
name. Yes, I try to be consistent. But yeah, I would love to hear from you and hear what's happening in your class, and if there's ever anything I can do to help support you as you're implementing productive struggle, please don't hesitate to reach out. I love having those conversations with people because it's ultimately it's all about the kids, and we need to look
Yeah.
at what are we doing to better meet the needs of every single student. So I'm always happy to have a quick 5 minute conversation with somebody to help them wrestle through a problem, to make sense of something, knowing that it's going to benefit all the students that you have influence over.
Yes, I love that. That is awesome. Well, hopefully I will get to see you in person coming up. I'm guessing you'll be at the September NCTM conference in Chicago.
I will definitely be there. I'm looking
Okay,
forward to
awesome.
it.
Well, yeah, I'll see you then. All right. Thanks everyone for joining me, and I cannot wait to talk math with you again soon.